On August 9th, 2014, in a town just outside of St. Louis called Ferguson, an 18-year-old kid named Michael Brown was shot and killed. Do you remember that? It made national news at the time. It hit closer to home for me because I had just moved to the area. I'd moved to St. Louis a year before that in 2013. And now I was at the center of what the news media outlets were all talking about. I was living in proximity to the cries of injustice coming up from the people for that young man, Michael Brown, was an African American. He was shot by a white cop. And if you don't know anything about St. Louis, you ought to know there is a deep racial divide. That town is literally split in half by a road. Whites on one side, blacks on the other, historically. And so this struck a deep nerve in the people. I lived close to it. I lived just south of Kings Highway in St. Louis, a few streets off of a place called Grand, where many came to protest. After the cop was exonerated, right? They said, this is injustice. This shouldn't have happened. He should be guilty. This cop should be guilty for what he did. And they protested in the streets. We kind of hunkered down in our apartment, but we could hear the voices raised. Could hear gunshots. The next day, walking the streets of Grand, we saw the businesses that failed to put up barriers to their businesses were broken into, stolen from. That was one response, was this outcry of people saying, this group has been marginalized, they have had injustices done to them, and they rallied the cry on behalf of the people. But then you heard another sort of narrative, another large group of voices that said, what has happened and what continues to happen is only the product of what you are reaping. You are reaping what you are sowing. You are getting the justice of your actions. And these statements were made oftentimes to try and hush the cries of injustice, to tune them out, to ignore them. But how do we respond as Christians to injustice? How do we even define what justice is? Is our response to just fight for the marginalized, and maybe ignoring the true facts of a case, or the justice that is at least served from those in place to judge? Or do we just assume that every problem that ever happens to anybody in the world is their fault and their fault alone, that they are the controller of their fate and their destiny? What does God's word tell us about justice? For many in the world today, they wouldn't even like to hear me talking about justice from a pulpit. For many in the world, they see Christianity as just another oppressive regime, a kind of a backwards and backwoods religion, archaic, with principles designed to basically build up those who are already in power and continue to oppress the weak and the vulnerable. I couldn't disagree more. Based on God's character and based on what he demonstrates to us in the scriptures about what he does against injustice. Today in our text from Micah chapter 6, we heard him basically summarize the role of the Christian as just that. What is required of you, O man? To do justice. Do justice. I want to look at Micah's 3 things he tells us: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. We got to understand what justice means for Micah. If that's the role of the Christian, according to Micah, to do justice, what does that mean? The Hebrew word for justice that Micah uses there, it's the word mishpat. It's found over 200 times in the Old Testament. So you get a sense of how important this is to God. Now, mishpat you might not always read as justice in the Bible. Sometimes it's translated as righteousness. Sometimes it's translated as defending the cause. Sometimes it's translated as judgment. But it all has to do with this idea of God's justice. of the world operating in accordance with how he created it to operate. And so there's really two sides to justice. You have kind of a negative side and a positive side. There is one negative sense of justice, that is stopping injustice, right? When someone breaks or breaches the law, punishment is served. So in Leviticus 24, we read in the Mosaic law that they are to have the same mishpat for the foreigner and for the native. It's one rule that applies to all. And if you break that rule, punishment is done. You condemn, you judge, and you punish the evildoer for the sake of flourishing, human flourishing. But there's another side to justice, to mishpat in the Old Testament. And this is the idea of giving the oppressed, weak, and vulnerable their due. God has designed us to work together as a community for those who have to give and support those who have not. So, for instance, in that same Mosaic law, when they would instruct the Hebrews to reap and glean their harvest, they would say, don't glean it all, but actually leave some. Don't scrape every last bit you can for yourself, but leave some of your grain, your produce, to be gleaned by the poor, by those who don't have land, by those who don't have access to resources. Lend them some of yours. Proverbs 31, verse 9 says, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So not only are we to care physically for the poor, but God says for those who have not a voice, who don't have influence in our culture, we need to stand up and speak for them. We need to actually listen to the cries of the oppressed and take up our voice for them. Who is it that is suffering but is being unheard? If you look up that word mishpat in the Old Testament, you'll find that there's kind of four categories of people that are commonly associated with it. It's the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor. One writer called this the quartet of the vulnerable. And that's the point, right? These people in Israel's society were more exposed, more vulnerable than those who had protections, right? They lived in a patriarchal society, so if you were widowed or fatherless, you were already at a huge disadvantage. You weren't going to have influence. You might not be taken care of, if not for the sake of other people. Job, if you remember him, he is defending his honor, his integrity before God when he's going through a hard time in his life. And hear what he says when he defends himself. He says in Job 29, I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless. I made the widows to sing. See, Job is saying that those who were vulnerable and weak, it was their due of God's to be taken care of. He doesn't describe it as charity. This is not us giving generously out of charity. Job is saying this is God's law, his intention for humanity, that it's actually sinful, not just to oppress the poor and the needy, but to ignore them. God says it is of me to listen to the poor and the needy. And we see both of those facets of justice, right? The negative and the positive, reflected in God himself. So there is the negative aspect. There are the commands of God, which he says you must follow and obey, and if you don't, I will visit the iniquity of you upon your head. Right? So God establishes the 10 commandments, and he's not shy about telling the threats of what's going to happen if you breach those laws. But God also cares for the weak and the vulnerable. We care for them, and Israel was charged to care for them because God cares for them. God would make these claim about himself. Basically, it's kind of like his calling card almost, right? You know, if you're going to talk about yourself, you want to share maybe the most important thing that you do, right? So when you introduce yourself, maybe you say, here's who I am, and this is what I do. Here's my job. When God introduces himself, listen to this. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, God talks about his power. He says, I am God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God. And then he says what he does. That I do justice. I execute justice for the fatherless and the widow. And I love the immigrant. Over and over in the scriptures, God introduces himself as a God of power, but for who? For the widows, for the single parent families, for those whom society often looks down upon, casts out, wants to kind of ignore, wants to maybe push to the margins even of a community, because they'd rather not have to see all that. And that's so different from the other gods of the Old Testament. The other gods associated themselves with the elite, right? The other gods of the nations would make themselves known through the kings, right? Pharaoh was seen as a manifestation of their God. Caesar in the time of Rome, he was seen as a manifestation of God, a deity, but not the God of the Israelites. The God of the Israelites says, I see who's at the bottom. I see who is scraping and grinding. God says, I hear the groans of the needy, and I see the poor being plundered, and so I will arise on their behalf. God works for those on the bottom to bring them up. And so we reflect that justice of God as his followers. But it goes deeper than that. This is where Micah gets into the motivation, right? How do we do the justice of God? Micah says to do justice, but he says also to love mercy. That word mercy is the Hebrew word chesed. Maybe you've heard that word before, chesed. It's the loving faithfulness of God. Chesed describes God's covenant to us, that he will never forsake or abandon us, that he is always there striving for his people to save them. Chesed is the reminder that everything we have is a grace. It's a gift of God. And the Israelites were never to forget that. Right? This was like the backbone of their ethic in their society. They weren't just told by God, you must do this because I'm God and I say so. Right? That would have been enough because he is God and he does say so. But no, when God gave the commands to the Israelites, when he said, go and love the sojourner among you, he said, do that because you were once sojourners. He says, remember how you were when I came to you. You were slaves in Egypt. Your backs were breaking under the oppression of Pharaoh, and I heard your cries rise to me, and so I came down to save you. Remember your story. And he says, if that's where you were when I came to you, how then can you let others live in that same reality? Or worse, oppress others in the same way? But that's actually what's going on when Micah comes to the people of Israel. Micah looks around and he sees the people of Israel oppressing the weak and the vulnerable. He sees those who have much and the kings and the priests spending it, enjoying and lavishing it on themselves. When he looks on the land, he sees a people who had hardened their hearts. But they're still coming to church, right? They're still worshiping. You saw that in the text, right? They're sacrificing the right sacrifices. They're tithing. They're worshiping God. And just for the record, God isn't saying don't do that. These aren't things God is discouraging. But he's saying, if all of your Christianity, if all of your following of me is just about coming to some place on a Sunday morning, but it doesn't translate into the love of people out there in the real world, then you're fooling yourself. This is how James would pick up the same argument in his epistle. It's filled with this talk of faith without works being dead. right? We are saved by faith alone, and we confess that. But faith never remains alone. Faith, it always transforms us so that acts of mercy are attendant to our faith. Because without that, why are we coming to worship? Why are we doing this at all? Well, the scriptures would say it's not for love of God, but it might actually be for love of self. To pat myself on the back, to think that I am a good person. There's a sort of hardening of our hearts that can happen, and it does happen. This dichotomy that happens where you look outside to the world and you say, you are only suffering what you're suffering because of what you've done. But you see, look at my life. I do the right things. I obey the rules. I listen to God, and therefore I am blessed and my life is good. Tim Keller passed away recently. I was grieving this just before worship with Lois Weber. And Tim Keller once said that to think that way, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, imagine putting yourself in the shoes of someone born in the 13th century outside Tibet and saying that if you just worked a little harder, if you tried a little harder, you could make your life good and well. He says that's ridiculous. You could never imagine that, right? It takes the grace of God to have what we have. When we think that way, we're forgetting that we didn't choose where we were born or the family situation we were born into. And we didn't choose the gifts and abilities that we have. Now, do we hone them? Of course. And the Proverbs even speak about putting in hard work because we too reap a lot of what we sow. But there's so much that is a grace to us. That is not us. We did not earn it, but God gave it to us. Our health, that's all grace. We can never put our emphasis on our doing. But return back to the heart of God. Remember where we were when God found us. It was His chesed, His love, that has brought us up to Him. And so that's how we walk humbly with our God. We do justice, we love God's loving kindness, and we walk humbly with God. And maybe, as we understand God's justice, we start to feel the weight of that humility, right? The weight of God's justice, what He's calling for us to do. Job really brings out the level of God's justice. So Job, remember, he's suffering, and he's trying to say, God, I don't know why this is happening to me. I don't feel like I deserve this. But he says, look, if I have sinned against you, then I do deserve this. So listen to Job. Listen to what he says. He says, if I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint to me, right, when I didn't listen to my employees, when they had a grievance, if I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or if I have eaten my morsel alone while the fatherless, the orphan, has not eaten of it, if I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, and I didn't warm them with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless in court, right? I had influence, but I raised it against them. I didn't help them when I could have. Then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder. Heavy words from Job. When I look at my life, the many people that I've passed, those corners in St. Louis that I used to drive by, seeing the homeless with the sign and turning my eyes away because I didn't feel like I could even look at them. It's not hard to feel the humility, but maybe it's hard to know, how do I walk with God? I feel the crushing weight of your commands, of this vision of justice you have. How do I walk with you? You go to Jesus. You go to Jesus who came to walk with us. Jesus there in Luke 4, he was quoting Isaiah 61. It was all about taking care of the poor, binding up the brokenhearted. Isaiah 61 finishes by saying, I have come, the Messiah has come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. The day of vengeance of our God. See, you see both sides of justice. The vengeance against the infractions of the law, but also the care of the poor, the lifting up the brokenhearted. And Jesus is saying, I am He. I am the one. That's my calling card. That God who spoke about this, that's me. But Jesus didn't finish quoting Isaiah 31. It's really striking, actually. Jesus, right, he ends by saying he's come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He cuts off mid-verse and says nothing about the vengeance of God. Now, why is that? Is Jesus just trying to soften the blow? Is he trying not to be offensive? No, Jesus can be plenty offensive. Why does Jesus stop short? Because Jesus has not come to bring the vengeance of God, but he has actually come to bear the vengeance of God. Jesus has come to uphold the law on our behalf, not to do away with it. We need law, we need order, we need justice, but we cannot bear it. And so when we look at the cross of Jesus, we see two things. We see, one, that God is not willing to let his justice go. He is not willing to put that aside. Justice must be done. But yet we see that you and I, we were the ones who done the injustice. We were the ones deserving of that death. Jesus lived the life that we couldn't live, and he died the death we should have died. But Jesus came to bear that judgment in our place. So how can we then go out into a world with anything other than a softness of heart? Anything other than with grace that God has given us? This doesn't mean we water down what is good and right. This doesn't mean we water down the laws that God has laid out for us that we ought to follow. But it does mean that we can never imagine that our lives are the way they are because of what we have done to create them. It's by God's grace. When you see that, when you let that penetrate to your heart, you'll become a more gracious person. You'll even find yourself doing justice because that's what God does. That's what his Spirit works in you. It works his justice out through you into the world. There's two sides, I think, to the justice conversation in the world today, politically anyway, and both of those sides can be really self-righteous. Both. One can say, you are reaping what you're sowing because of what you've done, and if you would just buck up, if you would just follow the system, if you would just abide by the law, you wouldn't have to deal with this. And maybe blows over all the other little pieces where they need help, where the vulnerable have not been lifted up, where justice hasn't been done according to God, according to Yahweh. And there are those who say, you need to rally behind the vulnerable and the weak. You need to support them and everything their cause is about, and if you don't, you are a horrible person. And how condemning is that? As Christians, we do neither. We look to the cross of Christ. We look to his word for our guidance and for the grace to live it out. Jesus, we ask you to bless us as your people to live according to your justice. Work on our hearts to take pity on those whom you pity, to love those who are pushed to the margins, to love the vulnerable as you do. Help us to be your hands and feet, we pray. In your name, Jesus. Amen. I invite you to stand as